They clapped like it was a coronation. The music swelled, the wine flowed, and the spotlight shifted toward Leo, the youngest son, the prodigal prince of nothing. At 24, Leo had never worked a double shift in his life. He'd burned 2 pans during brunch service once and laughed it off. But tonight, at his father's retirement party, he was handed the keys to Vincenzo's, the Italian restaurant their family had built from scratch in Portland. Julian stood off to the side, half shadowed behind the wine rack, his white chef's coat still stained from the lunch rush. He was the one who'd created every dish on the menu, who'd opened the kitchen at 5 a.m. for deliveries, and stayed late to clean up grease from the fryers. He had practically lived in that kitchen since he was 17, ever since his mother died. But now his name wasn't even mentioned. His father, Vittorio Vance, raised a glass and declared, "To the next era." With Leo at the helm, Vincenzo's will evolve, innovate. He'll take us forward. Julian's heart didn't break. It calcified. He had come out at 22, quietly, respectfully. No rainbow flags, no parades. Just a calm conversation over espresso after dinner. Vittorio had said nothing cruel. He didn't disown him. But from that day forward, he also never again introduced Julian as his heir. In fact, he stopped introducing him at all. They called Julian the heart of the kitchen behind closed doors. But in front of the investors, the friends, the loyal patrons, he was just our oldest, nothing more. Julian had poured himself into Vincenzo's. Every menu shift, every locally sourced herb, every burst of chili in his signature arrabbiata, that was him. The soul of the food, the rhythm of the kitchen, the reason people kept coming back. But when the time came to hand down the family dream, his father looked right past him. No one at the party seemed surprised. That's what hurt the most. His aunt clinked glasses with Leo. His grandmother kissed Leo's forehead. Even the regulars smiled and nodded like this made sense, as if Julian hadn't been the one sweating behind the line for a decade. He wanted to scream, or maybe just disappear. Instead, he wiped his hands on a dish towel, walked through the back exit, and stood in the alleyway behind the restaurant. The night air was cold, and his breath came out in clouds. He looked up at the glowing Vincenzo's sign, his mother's middle name, and for the first time in years, he felt like a stranger to it. Julian had been told all his life that if he worked hard, stayed respectful, made beautiful food, and didn't make a fuss about who he was, he would earn his place. But that night, as Leo soaked in applause for a future he hadn't earned, Julian finally understood. You don't get your seat at the table just by cooking the meal. Not in a family that only serves recognition to the sons who fit the mold. He didn't cry. He didn't argue. He simply pulled off his apron, left it on the hook, and walked out. Not just of the kitchen, but of the dream they had all pretended he belonged in. They had cut him out of the story, but they'd forgotten something. He wrote the recipes, and those are harder to erase than a last name on the deed. If you've ever been passed over, and not because you failed, but because you didn't fit, stay with us. This is Julian's story, and it's just getting started. Like, share, and subscribe to Heart Stories. Some recipes start in heartbreak, but end with fire. Julian didn't take the chef knives. He didn't take the framed photo of his mother that hung by the back pantry door. He left it all behind, not out of grace, but out of sheer exhaustion. Let Leo fumble through prep with manicured hands. Let his father taste what it meant to hand over something sacred to someone who only knew how to burn garlic. The next morning, Julian stood at the gates of a little garden home tucked into the quieter edges of the city. Claire opened the door before he knocked, a stout woman in a turquoise robe with a patchy cat nestled at her feet. "Julian Vance," she said, arms wide. "About time you stopped pretending that kitchen was enough." Claire had been his mother's best friend, the kind who brought soup when you were sick and never returned a Tupperware empty. After his mom's funeral, Claire was the first adult who wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "You don't need to change to be kept." And when he came out at 22, it was her guest room that waited when things got quiet at home. That same room, with its lavender curtains and antique quilt, became his refuge once again. While Julian unpacked, Leo unleashed chaos. Within days, Leo announced on social media that Vincenzo's was getting a modern glow-up. The restaurant was rebranded with a neon logo. Classical string music was replaced with synth pop. And the most offensive, he began serving dairy-free ravioli, with almond milk chame and calling it Italian-inspired wellness cuisine. Julian didn't follow the updates. He didn't need to. Word got to him through former co-workers, kitchen staff, who texted him in code like war correspondents. He tried to sue Vide Risotto, Jay. I had to walk out. But then came the betrayal that struck deeper than poorly cooked grains. One Tuesday morning, Claire sat at the breakfast table reading the city paper when her brows furrowed. She slid the page across to Julian without a word. There, on the food column, a feature about the restaurant's new signature dish, Leo's Inferno sauce. Julian felt something in his throat lock shut. He clicked on the restaurant's website. The new menu described the sauce in glowing terms: a fiery blend of Calabrian chilies, smoked paprika, and a secret blend of garlic confit and lemon zest. His recipe, word for word. He had spent 3 years perfecting it, balancing heat and acid, memory and intuition. It had been inspired by his mother's Calabrese roots and the time they'd visited the southern coast together. She used to joke, "If your food doesn't make them sweat a little, it's not love." Julian had called it La Fiamma. The flame. Now it was Leo's. The rage that bubbled in Julian's chest wasn't about copyright. It wasn't even about money. It was about dignity. He had accepted the silence, the demotion, the unspoken shame. But to watch his food, his mother's memory, be served under someone else's name, that was an erasure too far. Claire didn't tell him to sue. She didn't tell him to storm the kitchen. She simply poured him coffee and said, "What they stole can't be cooked right without the soul behind it." That night, Julian scribbled for hours in an old recipe book. Not to preserve what was lost, but to create something new. He remembered something his mom used to say when a dish failed: start again, but this time season it with truth. By the end of the week, he had a folder of revised recipes, variations of his classics, but updated, sharper, more daring. He added a note at the top of the page: "For the kitchen I will build, not the one I'm welcome in, but the one that welcomes me." He wasn't ready to fight, not yet, but he was ready to cook again. A text came in from Sophia, one of the waitresses who had always treated him like family. "A woman had an allergic reaction today. Ambulance came. They're saying it was the sauce. No allergen warning. Leo's panicking." Julian's hands went cold. He remembered. The garlic confit was traditionally mixed with cashew paste for consistency, something he'd removed later, but had noted in his original batch instructions. If Leo had used his old prep list, he'd just poisoned someone. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, his notes, and his mother's worn leather recipe binder. "I need to go," he told Claire. "The kitchen's on fire, and I'm the only one who knows how to put it out." The hallway of St. Vincent's Hospital smelled like sterile lemon and stale panic. Julian pushed through the double doors just as the ambulance sirens faded in the distance. A nurse glanced up at him. Recognition flashed across her face, maybe from years of catering charity galas with Vincenzo's, and she pointed wordlessly down the hall. Julian found the girl's mother outside room 314, shaking, mascara streaked down both cheeks. "They said she ordered the Inferno pasta," she kept repeating, like she was clinging to that sentence for air. She asked if there were nuts. They said no. Julian didn't knock. He walked straight in. Inside the room, a teenage girl lay unconscious, wires spidered across her chest, lips swollen, color slowly returning to her face. Leo sat hunched in a chair beside her, fingers curled into his knees, as if willing the world to rewind 24 hours. Their father stood at the window, staring out at the streetlights, like they held some kind of salvation. Neither of them heard Julian enter. It wasn't until the door clicked shut behind him that Leo turned. His eyes widened, like he'd just seen the ghost of someone buried alive. "You shouldn't be here," Leo said, voice ragged. Julian didn't respond. He walked to the foot of the hospital bed, pulled out his notebook, and flipped to the allergen index he'd handwritten years ago. A list of every potential sensitivity linked to their sauces. Under La Fiamma, he tapped the ingredient: cashew pure. "Did you use my old base recipe?" he asked. Not accusing, just tired. Leo swallowed hard. "I didn't. I thought..." "You thought wrong," Julian snapped, sharper than he intended. You thought you could take what I built and slap your name on it without understanding what made it work. And now she almost died. Vittorio turned slowly. His eyes met Julian's, and for the first time in years, they didn't slide past him like he was some unspeakable shame. I need your help, Vittorio said simply. Julian blinked. What? I need you to fix this. The restaurant, the damage, He gestured at the room, his voice cracking. Everything. Julian stared at him. For a moment, time twisted. He saw himself, 14 again, holding a plate of homemade gnocchi, glowing with pride, only for his father to grunt and say, "Don't let your hands get too soft." He saw the day he came out, the silence, the awkward dinner that followed where no one spoke, where Leo loudly changed the subject and Vittorio pretended Julian had said nothing at all. Now here they all were, bent under the weight of a single sauce. "No," Julian said. "I won't fix what I didn't break." Leo looked up. "Then what do you want?" Julian leaned against the wall. He crossed his arms. "You want me to come back? Fine, but I don't come back as your ghost. I come back as your partner." "What?" "I want 50% ownership," Julian said. "I want creative control over the menu. And I want Dad," he turned to Vittorio, "to stand in front of every staff member and tell them why I was never allowed to be more than a shadow. I want him to say it wasn't because I lacked talent, but because he didn't know how to love someone who didn't look like himself." The silence was thick. "That's not fair," Leo muttered. "No," Julian replied. "What happened today wasn't fair. Me putting out your fire again, like I always have, without being given a name or a seat, that's not fair. This is the Gushtivim." Vittorio closed his eyes. "I'll do it." Leo looked stunned. "What?" "I'll say it," Vittorio said. His voice had that same heaviness it did the day their mother died, when he finally admitted he'd been wrong about the chemo. Julian was always the heart of the kitchen. "I knew it. I just didn't want to see it." Julian's chest felt like it might cave in, not from joy, not yet, but from the weight of what had finally been said aloud. He turned to leave. "Send me the paperwork," he said, "and schedule the meeting. Until then, you're not using another drop of that sauce." As he stepped into the hallway, a nurse caught his arm. "Hey, are you the one who created that recipe?" Julian hesitated. "Yeah," the nurse smiled. "She's gonna be okay. You saved her too." Julian nodded, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. On the kitchen, the flames, the crew who had stood behind him even when his own family didn't. He thought about Claire, probably sipping tea right now and pretending she wasn't tracking this all on Facebook. It wasn't just about being back in the kitchen. It was about taking the heat and finally owning the fire. The kitchen at Vincenzo's was closed for the first time in 5 years. The whiteboard, usually covered in prep lists and pasta specials, had been wiped clean. The smell of garlic and basil was absent, replaced by silence and tension. Every sous chef, line cook, and dishwasher stood shoulder to shoulder, arms folded, eyes shifting between the door and their worn-out sneakers. Then the door opened. Julian walked in first, wearing the old apron that still had his embroidered initials on the strap. He looked every person in the eye as he passed. Some smiled faintly, a few nodded. Most just watched, waiting. Behind him came Vittorio, slower than usual, hands clasped tightly together like he was holding something fragile. Leo trailed them both, face unreadable. Claire stood near the espresso machine, arms crossed. Julian had invited her not out of ceremony, but because he knew she was the only one who'd hold him upright if this turned into another silence. Vittorio cleared his throat and stepped forward. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at the floor like he was searching for words buried under tiles. "When I opened this place," he began, voice gravelly, "I wanted to bring a piece of home to Portland, something from Naples, something real. I thought the only way to do that was through tradition, through blood, through sons." He looked at Leo, then at Julian. "I thought strength looked like noise, like control, like straight lines," he chuckled bitterly. "But what I didn't see, what I refused to see, was that the soul of this restaurant was never in the rules. It was in the hands that made the dough rise, in the care that went into every plate. It was in my eldest son. And I chose not to see him because he came out as gay." No one moved. The sound of the espresso machine humming in the background filled the room like static. I never said it out loud, Vittorio continued, but I treated him like a guest in his own kitchen. I stole his voice by pretending it didn't belong here, and that was wrong. He turned to Julian. You built Vincenzo's, and I tried to hand it to someone else because I was afraid of what others would say, of what it meant about me, but mostly, I was afraid to admit I was wrong about you. Julian didn't speak. His arms remained crossed, his jaw clenched. Then Claire stepped forward. And? She asked, loud enough to snap a few heads. Vittorio exhaled slowly. And I am proud of who you are, and who we should have been. The words didn't fix everything, but they landed. Julian stepped up to the pass window and placed a new menu draft on the counter. From today on, he said, we cook with full transparency. No more unlabeled allergens. No more shortcuts, no more hiding. Every dish has a story, and it's going to be told. A young line cook named Matteo raised his hand. Does this mean you're staying? Julian nodded. I'm not just staying, I'm co-owning. Gasps, smiles, a few claps. Julian added, also, I'm bringing back the ricotta, and I'm retiring Leo's Inferno. Laughter broke the tension. Even Leo smiled faintly, raising a hand in mock surrender. Later that night, after everyone had left, Julian and Vittorio sat at the back booth, the same one Julian used to hide under as a kid while waiting for his dad to finish a shift. You're still mad, Vittorio said. Julian looked at him. I'm still hurt, but I'm also tired of being angry. It doesn't taste good anymore. Vittorio nodded. What does? Justice, Julian said, and balsamic reduction. They both chuckled. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was something. A few days later, Julian redesigned the dining room, stripped away the deep paneling, brought in more light, repainted the walls in soft ochre, like his mother's favorite scarf. He curated a new playlist filled with Italian ballads and old jazz. But the most notable change was the framed photo above the host stand. It showed Julian as a teenager, flour on his cheek, holding up a ladle of soup with a giant grin. Next to it, a brass plate read, "The soul behind the sauce." Some customers noticed, others didn't. But every queer kid who walked in for the first time and saw that photo saw a piece of themselves honored, not hidden. Vincenzo's wasn't perfect. It still had its slow nights, still had Yelp reviews from customers who thought the eggplant was too experimental. But now it had something stronger than nostalgia. It had a spine. 1 year later, the clinking of silverware and low hum of conversation filled a different dining room. This one smaller, warmer, with light pouring in from big windows framed in vines. The sign above the door read Julian's Table, painted by hand in soft gold over forest green. No surname, no family legacy, just a name, his name. The walls were lined with framed menus from restaurants Julian had worked in, interspersed with photographs of dishes he'd created, each with a small plaque crediting the chef who inspired them. The signature item? A reimagined version of his original sauce, now called Firenze Ember, spicy, smoky, and unmistakably his. Julian opened the restaurant with Claire, his mother's best friend and his own guardian angel. She handled the front of house, still telling customers their hands better be clean or she'll know. 3 of his favorite former co-workers from Vincenzo's had followed him here. They said it was because of the pay. Everyone knew it was the dignity. Julian didn't advertise the place much. It didn't need it. Word of mouth from customers who had tasted his truth was enough. They came not just for the food, but for the atmosphere. A place where no one had to hide, where difference wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated. He'd added a tiny line to the bottom of every menu. Come as you are, eat like you belong. Meanwhile, Leo had opened a frozen pizza stand in the local shopping mall called Leo's Fire. It was flashy. It had LED signs and pop music. But reviews were lukewarm. The food was fine, forgettable. It didn't hurt Julian. Not anymore. If anything, he hoped his brother had found peace in doing things his way. As for Vittorio, he didn't return to Vincenzo's. He sold his shares and moved into the countryside with Julian's grandmother. But he called often now, not to ask about the business, but to ask about recipes, about the new risotto flavor Julian was experimenting with, about Claire's health. He never said sorry again. But sometimes when Julian talked about the pride he felt in his kitchen, Vittorio's voice would shake. And that was enough. One quiet Sunday morning, Julian unlocked the doors early and found a small package at the threshold. Inside was an old, worn recipe book. His mother's handwriting covered every page, annotated in the margins with her notes. Too much oregano, trust me, and stuck with post-its that had nearly faded. A note sat on top. I saved this. She would have wanted you to have it now. Cook with love. That's what she said. Dad. Julian read it 3 times, hands trembling, heart heavy. He didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the ache was already part of the flavor of his life. Layered, bittersweet, familiar. That night, he hosted a private dinner for a local LGBTQ+ youth organization. The kids sat at one long communal table. Some wore makeup, some wore baseball caps. Some didn't speak much, but they all cleaned their plates. And when Julian walked out to greet them, the youngest asked, "You're the chef, right? What's your secret?" Julian smiled and pointed to the chalkboard above the open kitchen. It read, "Our kitchen has one secret ingredient, dignity." He answered, "That, and maybe a little smoked paprika." They laughed and clapped, and someone took a photo, one where Julian stood dead center, not behind the scenes. A photo no one would crop him out of. Outside, the Portland night stretched wide and calm. The scent of roasted garlic and rosemary spilled onto the street. Julian locked the doors, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the quiet hum of a restaurant that finally felt like home. They tried to silence the chef, but he wrote the recipe in his own name. Have you ever had to walk away from something you built, just to build something better on your own terms? If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who's been left behind but still rose. Subscribe to Heart Stories, where every table has a seat for you.